some interesting patterns in human behavior that I want to point out. Some things that we try to accomplish. Think about when you want to reconnect, when you want to reorient what's happening, when you want to take a minute to just breathe and reset, when you want to make a big deal about something, when you want to remember intimate things, that are important details or unimportant details, when you want to go back and visit how things have affected you in the past, or when you're trying to shape yourself for looking forward with hope to the future. We do these things, and they come in different forms, but think about them. How would you accomplish any of those things if you're trying to reinvigorate this relationship? You're trying to reorient your path. You're trying to rekindle your hope. Or maybe you're just trying to restore after a hard thing. We do it through maybe a family reunion. How would you do it in the sense of a birthday party, or a funeral, or a wedding, an anniversary, or a celebration supper? We take these times and we put them in our calendar, and really what we accomplish is all of those really important verbs that start with reinvigorate, rekindle, reimagine, reestablish, rejuvenate. When we're lacking motivation to go forward, or when we need help, we take the time to sit down and carve out these moments where we can remember and celebrate. That's what happens. You do this, and sometimes without thinking about it. When you have that friend who is so helpful to you in a season, and you thought, I've lost touch, I just need to go back, and what do? Well, let's get lunch together. And you sit together, and you kind of remember what it was like and the things that you've gone through, and you sort of celebrate the good things that have come out of that, and that provides hope and maybe a path forward for you. It's the same thing. Why does a married couple really want to go on a date together? So they can remember, so they can celebrate. It can get them back on track. It can keep them close. It can strengthen. Why do we want to sit around after a funeral and share a meal? So we can remember the unimportant things and the important things and how they've stacked up to be a life that we can celebrate. Why do we not want to miss that family reunion, or not miss that nephew's birthday party, or not miss the 60-year marriage anniversary party? Because those things represent this time where we can remember and we can celebrate. This morning, as we jump into this passage, we're going to see those two potent verbs come together to create this pattern for the Israelite community. We're going to see Moses speak to the Israelites and say, listen, remember all these things, and it'll lead you to a place where you celebrate. And that equation, if you will, that process, that habit, is going to create a life path for you. We're going to be in Deuteronomy, but before we get in there, let me get a little nerdy, all right? Let me throw out some of this. If you look at the structure of the book of Deuteronomy, this is how we've organized the sermon schedule. This is how I want you to understand the book. Because coming away from Deuteronomy, I want you guys to be able to say, I know what Deuteronomy is about. I get it. This is how Moses organized the book. It's how we should probably look at the book. Now, if you remember, we went back and we looked at Israel's history, chapters 1 through 3. This is what they went through. This is how it went. It wasn't great. We got to chapter 4 and he says, hey, you guys, you need to pay attention. Please obey. Please be faithful to God. And then he gets into why. There's going to be these blessings for obedience. There's going to be these curses for disobedience. This is what it's going to be like if you walk away from God. You need to choose to be faithful. And then this big middle section is where we're going to be spending some of our time today and next week, where he actually takes those 10 commandments that he laid out in chapter 5, and he's going to sort of unravel them for us. I'll explain that in a second, because if you look at the way this book is structured, there's a design to it. In the business, we call this a chiasm, right? This is a chiastic structure, meaning there's matching parts that lead to the singular point in the middle. And you're like, I still don't see it. I color coordinated it for you, all right? So you have a history and you have a future. Do you see how those match up? And then there's this call to faithfulness on either side. And there's this explanation. You need to obey, or if you rebel, choose which one you're going to do. And on the other side, obey and choose to rebel, and this is the consequences of those. And then in the middle, there's this big section where he gives very applicable, very realistic to them exhortation. This is how you have to live. This is what it means to take those 10 commandments I talked about and put them into real life for you, Israel. This is what it's going to mean to remember and celebrate and live according to God's design. He's going to do something pretty interesting here. These 10 commandments, they are going to be unraveled and shown across multiple chapters. And there's overlap. Okay, so we're going to be working through the first 4 of the 10 commandments today in the chapters that Moses laid out. And this is what he kind of does. You know Play-Doh? If you have kids, you go through the big Play-Doh phase where it's just everywhere and it dries and it gets hard and surprisingly sharp and it cuts your feet in the middle of the night. I've heard about it. And there's always this like gross brown color, right? That is the future hope of all Play-Doh. Eventually, it all gets mixed together enough that it all loses and you just end up with one gross brown lump, okay? What Moses is going to do here is he's going to line out the 10 commandments, different colors of Play-Doh, and he's going to squish them together, and then he's just going to kind of roll it back and forth. You know what I'm talking about? You roll it like this, and what happens is those colors start to merge. He's not going to get to the gross brown yet, okay? But he's going to start to merge. So when he starts talking about, hey, you need to have no other gods before me, it's not just a singular, okay, wrote it down, got it, next. What he does is he shows, if you have no other gods before me, it's going to affect you this way. In fact, it'll make sure that you don't make images of other gods, these idols. And if you're following that and you're paying attention to where your heart is trying to project forth what God is or create those idols, then it really will make sure that you're not misusing my name or my authority. And so you see this gray happening across the colors, this grouping of them that unfolds into a life that he gives these laws. I don't want you to just know these random commands. I want this to be so ingrained and so applicable to your life as an Israelite that your heart is actually putting out the action that belongs to God's heart. It's God's heart overflowing to yours, overflowing to your life. That's his vision for what this is. And realistically, you can't separate out all these commands. They don't exist that way. Think about it. You can't say, all right, well, that one command where it says, don't commit adultery. It's like, all right, I won't do that one, but you know what? I'm going to be an adulterer, but I guess I won't covet. Well, you know what? I'm going to have no other gods, but I will make some idols to worship. Well, you can't really lie and steal and then claim one isn't really the other. It's hard to steal while you're being really truthful, isn't it? Right? So these things, they gray into one another, and they unfold into an action, into a life. Let me show you what I mean. Last week when we covered verses 6 through 11, or chapter 6 through 11, we introduced the 10 commandments in 5, and then he spent the rest of the time really laying out the holiness of God. If you're to have no other gods before Yahweh, if there's no other gods, it's because you believe him. When God says, I am holy, I am the only God, then that means you can't believe that there's other gods, right? Like it's not hard concept. It's exclusive is my point. So he's going to unfold the understanding of the holiness of God is the fruit of knowing that there is no other God than Yahweh. He's going to do that throughout this whole thing. So let's start with this second command, that you shall not make an image. You shall not make for yourself an image or an idol. God's going to roll out a desire that's in our hearts to shape God to be the way we want him. So we say, oh, there's no other gods. Sure. But the God I worship does tend to look a lot like me. He does tend to like the things I like, dislike the people I dislike. He tends to have parameters and he tends to have expectations that are very convenient for me. He says, you're not going to do that. We immediately think when he says, don't make for yourself an image, or depending on how old school your Sunday school teacher was, graven images or make for yourself idols. So we think in terms of having this one small thing, but what he's describing here is making an image the way that he's made us in his image. It says you don't get to make God in your image. That's not how it works. You don't get to craft for yourself the God who has your expectations and your desires. This is what he says. You need to worship me the way I want to be worshiped. Deuteronomy 12, verses 2 through 5, says, destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from those places. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, but you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all the tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. So what he's getting at is the fact that God's going to choose a specific place, which we know later is going to be this temple. I'm going to choose a specific place, a specific time, a specific way, with specific attitudes that I want you to worship me. And you don't get to craft a God that wants it your way. This isn't Burger King. You don't get to do that. This God has a specific way that he wants to be worshiped. He does it in this talk about like the physical act of gathering to present offerings and do that. And then in a minute, he's going to talk about it in terms of his revelation or his word. But this is all under this heading of we're not going to make God how we want him. If you've done any sort of evangelism or maybe there's people in your life this way that you talk to them, you say, oh, I'd love for you to be a part of my church, or let me tell you about Jesus. Or they say, oh, I know about God. Like, I know Jesus. And you're like, oh, well, that's great. Where do you worship? Where do you go to church? What's your church family like? And they're like, well, I don't really do church. I like Jesus. It's just me and Jesus, Me and Jesus. That's all I need. I don't really need it that way. And it's like, well, hold on. See, because God said you needed it to do it that way. God prescribed a way that he wants to be worshiped. And you run into people and they're like, yeah, I don't really like giving my money. Yeah, I'm fine with church, and I'm fine. In fact, I will give money, but I don't really like serving other people. And it's like, man, that's what he said we need to do. So you can't claim that he is God, but then claim that you're just going to worship him the way that you decide you want to worship him. God lines out for them. You don't get to choose wherever you want to do it just because the other nations did it that way. You need to worship me for who I am. And so there's this sense of like submission to that, right? Like we're not God. And he's calling us into this obedience. And look what happens. Don't try to change this. Don't try to change what God's revealed to you. See that you do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. So this is pretty stringent. He's got his way. He's got how to do it that way. He's got when to do it that way. He's got where to do it that way. And he says, and don't mess with it. Don't touch it. I like it this way. I've made it just how I'd like it, and you don't need to mess it up. What happens when people do? What happens when people come and they say, I think maybe we should worship God the way this kind of pagan religion does, or, I saw these people do it, or I used to do it this way and I kind of like how that makes me feel. So maybe we should just do it that way. Maybe we should approach God on those terms. When those people come to you, he says, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. If somebody's coming and they're saying, hey, live in this way that's opposite from the way that God's already told us to live, the Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart and with all your soul. It is the Lord your God you must follow, and him you must revere, or we would say fear. Keep his commands and obey him. Serve him and hold fast to him. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death for inciting rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. That prophet or dreamer tried to turn you from the way the Lord your God commanded you to follow. You must purge the evil from among you. Boy, he gets a little hot here. Hey, this is how I want to be worshiped. This is what it means for me to reveal myself to you. This is who I am. And if someone's coming along and changing that, they're not from me. If someone's coming along and revealing to you, oh, no, actually it's fine for us to live in this way or to do this thing or to worship this way, that is actually opposite of what God already said. No, it's fine. It's fine. I've done it before. He says, get rid of that. That's cancer. In fact, if you want to get really personal about it, he pushes into this and it's the person where it says, if this is your friend or this is your family member and they come to you and they say this and they entice you, hey, I've been trying this. And they're trying to pull you into that. It says you should be the one to cast the first stone. Tough. What a high view of God's revelation. What a high view of who God has revealed himself to be, where he says, this is who I am, and we aren't allowed to change it. Paul actually uses this phrase, he quotes this verse in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 13, where he talks about church discipline. And there's somebody in the church that's dealing with this sexual immorality and is fine with it. It's just like, I'm just going to live this way. It's terrible. It's sinful. God hates it. But you know what? I think it's fine. And he says, purge that person from among you. What are you doing? You're allowing this sin to exist. And by just nature of association, what you're saying is, this is what God wants. This is okay with God. We have the word, and God's revealed himself to us, and in that revelation, he showed us it's okay to live this way. That's what you're saying by allowing this to all exist in here. And he says, purge that. Get rid of that. Now, I'm not talking about mistakes. I'm not talking about somebody misspeaks. I'm not talking about somebody's learning, and they're trying to understand. I'm talking about people who love their sin. People who are trying to rope others into their sin. Purge it from among you. Why? Because you don't get to remake God how you think is most politically acceptable at the time. We don't have that option. We don't make God in our image. He's revealed himself, and we live by that. Look at when you get to commandment 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. This is from 13, and it's going into 14. Moses transitions. I'm not going to just talk to you about, hey, you're showing people what it means. Now he gets into this concept of using the authority, using vows, using the way we relate to God in the wrong way. Do you see how they kind of gray together? As Moses kind of rolls the Play-Doh back and forth, we go from, hey, don't make God in your own image, because what will happen is now you're using God's authority, you're using his name to accomplish what you want. Don't misuse the Lord's name. We've heard that, don't take the Lord's name in vain. Now, for some of us, grow up in different houses, that means you're not allowed to say a certain phrase. Okay? Not here to start any fist fights. We shouldn't use God's name loosely. But what I think the deeper meaning connected to this is that you are claiming his name, claiming his authority to teach something false. You're claiming his authority to do something wrong. You're rubber stamping his name on what you're doing, and that authority is working through you to what you're doing and saying, no, this is what God wants. It goes like this. It goes like, as a Christian, I'm really offended at your political view. What am I doing there? Well, as a Christian, what does that mean? As one of God's, right? As a child of God, in the family of God, I'm using his last name to sort of get the door open, and I'm saying, hey, based on that, I'm offended. Now, there's reasons to be offended about things, but we don't get to choose what God's offended about. He should choose what we're offended about. That's how that works. What happens when we misuse it is when we say, I'm going to step into this mess, whatever the argument is, whatever the thing is. I'm going to use his authority or his leverage or his name to establish that God hates what you're doing. God disagrees with what you're doing. Careful. Are you just upset about it and then you're piggybacking him onto it? Because what should happen is we look to God and God says, I abhor certain things. I hate certain things. I'm upset about certain things. You want to learn what God is wrathful about? There's no shortage of examples. You can find them. But what we do is we take these secondary things or these tertiary things or these quadrucial, I don't know what that other word is, the next level down there, but we take those things and we make them a priority, make them a gospel issue. And we say, God's upset about this. Careful. Careful. Don't use the Lord's name in vain. The whole section here is expressing that when we know the holiness of God, we're going to treat him with special regard. Like it affects us. I know how good God is, and that's going to affect how I speak about him. It's going to affect how I let you speak about him. You ever get offended, right, on somebody's behalf? Right? Go back to elementary school, late elementary school. Like, your mama's so ugly. And you'd be like, hey, she's a nice lady, right? And you're like, you're there. You're going to defend her honor. Don't talk about my mama. Why? That's her name. I care about her. What you're saying, what you're associating her with, the association you're making from that name to that thing is not true. I'm offended. You're using that in vain. And he says, when you understand the holiness of God, what he's going to actually do for you in goodness, what he's actually going to do against sin in a pure hatred of sin, you don't speak loosely about it. You don't let other things get caught up. So what are you doing in the name of God's authority, right? I've met more than a few people whose parents have misused God's authority to mistreat them. What do they view God as? A bully, abuser, right? I've known more than a few people who have used God's name to excuse sin. No, God doesn't care if you do that. No, it's fine. And what do those people end up thinking of God? He's nothing. He's yellow-bellied. It's whatever. Don't misuse God's name. Don't stamp his name onto things that he hasn't stamped his name onto. That holiness, as Moses expresses it to the people, is going to root down so deeply into their life, it'll actually be lived out on the day-to-day through things that you wouldn't even assume. He goes, you're going to hold to the authority of God so much that it's going to come into your minds, it's going to come into so even what you eat is going to be defined by the holiness of God. Right? That's a cultural thing, right? If you know people who are Jewish, traditionally, or you read the Bible, there's a lot of laws attached to how they're supposed to live. Why? Well, because you are the children of the Lord your God. He's going to give some examples here. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession. Now, it's kind of weird to go to laws about haircuts, right? But what's he doing? He's saying the local sort of pagan religions would have these worship on behalf of the dead things and these rituals of mourning that were against God. And he's saying, I don't want you to use my name in that because that's not what I want. That's not who I am. Don't show up with my authority, with my name, and attach it to that. It's wrong. That's not who you are. I've chosen you to be a part of me. I did not choose you so I could become a part of you. He's pulling us out. He's pulling the Israelites into a place of holiness. They live differently. Commandment number 4, chapters 14 through 16, he says, commandment number 4 is to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And we see the shift, the slow fade out of that discussion into the Sabbath when Moses actually takes this a place that you wouldn't maybe expect. The Sabbath, as he defined earlier in chapter 5, it's to remind you that you're not enslaved anymore. It's to remind you that God's actually rescued you from being enslaved. He's saved you from that. When you're a slave, you don't take a day off. Call in sick to Pharaoh. It doesn't work. You say, that's not your life anymore. I'm going to bring you into a place where you're actually free. And so what happens is you can rest in my provision. You have a chance to rest. You have a chance to step back, and I don't have to do that. I don't have to be controlled by that. And again, I think he's going to apply this really interestingly. He goes to tithing. Isn't that something? You read through there, and the tithing that he talks to is a joyful tithing. Now, here's the deal. You cannot be a joyful giver You cannot be a generous person if you're enslaved to money. Your idea of rest is like the Scrooge McDuck, like he's jumping into the coins, all the gold around him. This is the best. That's what rest is. I need the money. I need it all around me. That's what keeps me safe. That's what my trust is in. He comes down to this joyous generosity. And I think that's I'm not saying that this is your issue. If you're a generous person, and praise God, if you're somebody who struggles with generosity and you're being honest and objective, you're like, man, objectively, I wish I was more generous. I really do. I'm not saying this is it, but I would encourage you to look at this concept of enslavement to money. Do you have to have it? Right? It's what consumes your thoughts. It's what owns you. The idea of a Sabbath heart is that I'm resting that God will provide for me, that he's pulled me away from everything else that claimed me. I don't have to do that. It doesn't have to consume my waking thoughts. I don't have to be addicted to this. It's not just my career. It's not just my work. It's not just my money. I don't have to check it. How many times a day are you looking at that account? What's the market doing? I got to know. I get that we live in a world and we're affected by things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being enslaved, being controlled. The invitation to a place of rest is an invitation out of slavery. Does that money control you? Moses goes on, he explains here, very interesting, that the Sabbath heart, producing this generosity, overflows to a society, and the Israelites, he starts giving these laws of debt forgiveness. Debt forgiveness. Every 7 years, you forgive the debts, people who owe you. Yeah, that would shake up your life quite a bit, wouldn't it? That would change some things. That would change how things go. If you're out there consistently being generous and portraying a forgiveness in the way you deal with money, I think that would really be impactful, don't you? And I already know some of you guys, you're going, all right, we're going to do a 6-year loan. It's going to balloon. 28% interest, compounds weekly. We can do this. We can get away with it. Now he knows your sinful little hearts. Deuteronomy 14, 7 through 11 says, if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among you fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Yeah, you can't get away with it. He sees your heart. He knows you're being begrudging. He knows you're being stingy. Now, just picture this for a second. The painting in front of these Israelites is, I want you to come into this. This is the pitch. I want you to come into a place that's defined by rest and forgiveness. I want you to think through every single economy that the world has ever known. I have to go to this side of the stage because it's so different. It's founded on work and debt. That's true, right? Every economy that's ever existed, every society that's ever, it hasn't been, hey, we're going to be founded in this rest. We're going to be operating on forgiveness. No, we're going to be founded on work, and we're going to operate with functional debt. Here's the deal. He paints this picture for them, and Israelites don't get there. They don't get there. They don't live this out perfectly. There are times where they engage it, but the heart issue underneath corrupts their society. That the rest that God's inviting them into, to fully rely on him for provision, overflowing into generosity, the generosity producing a life of forgiveness, where indentured servitude, yeah, we reached the 7th year, so you're free to go. It's fine. I'll absorb it. I forgive your debts. That never becomes the norm. That's never the life of Israel. Because imagine if it was. Imagine if it was. If there was a group of people that we could go to and we could see how it's just rest. It's just forgiveness. It's just generosity. It floats. And we all know the dangers of the human heart, though, right? Because the minute we would say, hey, let's start doing this, there'd be somebody in there that would take advantage of everybody, right? We know that deep down, we don't know what that rest fully is. We don't know what that joy fully is. We don't know what that Sabbath, generous, forgiving love really is. We need someone to teach that to us. He unfolds this because he knows if you go from that rest to that forgiveness and generosity, it's going to produce celebration. If you remember all that God's done for you, it produces a celebration within. He says, I want you to celebrate the Passover, which will cause you to remember that God has provided for you and rescued you. I want you to celebrate the Feast of Weeks, where you give offering upon offering because God has given you so much. I want you to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, or we call it ingathering. And what do you do there? Chapter 15. It says, be joyful at your festival. For 7 days, celebrate the festival to the Lord your God. And I think when you put it in those frames, like, to really be joyful at the thought of giving to God, to be joyful at the thought of forgiving other people's debts, just be honest, like that's a little opposite of where you come from. It's a little opposite of the heart attitude that we all woke up with, right? It's difficult to live there, but that's the command. He says, if you really remember what God has done, it causes you to celebrate these opportunities to worship him, these opportunities to grow in this together. Moses looks at Israel and says, you belong to God. He's freed you. You belong to him. Don't allow your heart or your mind or your soul to act like it's enslaved to something else, whether that be the money or the career, the expectation that those people place on you. Don't allow yourself to be enslaved because it doesn't own you. The money doesn't own you. The work doesn't own you. The career doesn't own you. The reputation doesn't own you. Let go of it. Rest. Know what it means to rest, that God will provide. Don't sell your soul for it. Don't sell your heart for it. Don't sell your joy for it or your peace. Instead, rest. Remember what he's done. Remember who he is. And you can celebrate what he's doing. And all those words come into your life again. The rejuvenation. All the remembering. It produces a refilling of joy. A reestablishing of peace. Because if I'm being honest, like if we are being really honest, most of us really struggle with that. Most of us struggle, and when I say live a life of rest, you're like, I don't even know what that means. Like what I know is stress. What I know is to-do lists. What I know is crushing pressures of anxiety, forcing me down to the deadline. What I know is fighting really hard to get what I want because nobody's ever helped me. And we say these things, well, just rest. And it feels alien. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? That you and I need something different. Looking backward from this side of the tomb, from this side of the empty tomb that Jesus walked out of, we can see a little bit clearer what God was doing for his people. How he was laying this foundation of perfection and what should be that they couldn't attain yet, that they couldn't live out because of that sin. A Christian can hear these commands and see that the life that Moses is preaching about is actually kind of our hope. A life of rest and a life of celebration. You think through those commands. Jesus claimed that he was God. We should have no other gods before Jesus says, I am God. I and the Father are one, right? Or he says you should have no image made, and Colossians tells us that Jesus is the perfect image of the invisible God. You say, don't use God's name in vain. And he says, what my and the Father's will are one. What he said, he's speaking for the Father. When it says, protect the Sabbath, keep it holy. And he says, hey, just so you know, I made the Sabbath. I am the rest you need. The life and the hope that we get maybe excited about, or at least long for, that we see back in Deuteronomy that they couldn't get to, is given to us in the work of Jesus. That when he came and died on the cross, he opened a way that we could never get to those, but now we can because of who he is. The faith that we walk in is when we stop and we remember he's been faithful, even though we haven't. And we celebrate he's given this to us, even though we don't deserve it. Remember and celebrate. As Christians, we're making a claim when we talk about Jesus. We're claiming that he's done what we needed to. And we can live in that life. We can experience, at least in part, the joy that can come out of this, the rest, the forgiveness. We're going to celebrate communion together. And I think it's appropriate that when you look back in these chapters, Moses has called his people again and again to remember. Remember how you were slaves. Remember how God rescued you. Remember his power. Remember his wrath. Remember his promise. Remember his kindness. Remember his forgiveness. And here at the end of our passage, he calls them to celebrate. Celebrate. Celebrate what God's done. This morning we remember the Lord Jesus, and we celebrate communion together.